Everything you learned about the Atlantic slave trade is a lie. Your textbook said 12 million Africans were enslaved. The real death toll? Up to 20 million black lives. Millions died before ships even arrived, in raids, during brutal forced marches, locked in disease-filled dungeons on the African coast. 142 black people were even drowned alive to collect insurance money. And it was legal. That happened on one slave ship, and nobody faced any consequences. But that's just one ship. And what they don't tell you is how many more millions of black lives were erased before anyone even bothered to count them. What did those statistics actually look like? Imagine a goldsmith working in his West African village in 1750. White raiders storm in with chains ready. His wife's screams echo as they drag him away. His children watch their father disappear into the forest, never to return. He becomes one line in a ship's ledger. His family's grief, his community's collapse, his obliterated future. None of that gets counted in the 12 million. In this video, we're exposing the human reality behind every lie they taught you about the Atlantic slave trade. The horror started on land. They called it the First Passage, and your teachers never mentioned it exists. Captured Africans were force-marched up to 300 miles from interior villages to the coast. Imagine walking that distance with your ankle chained to a stranger's ankle, a rope around your neck, connecting you to 50 other people in a human chain. Research shows 10 to 15% died during these marches. They collapsed from exhaustion. They died when the iron shackles cut deep enough to cause infection. Some simply gave up, their bodies shutting down before they ever saw the ocean. Their corpses were left on roadsides. No graves, no names, no memory. European traders created this system deliberately. They never went inland themselves. Malaria killed them too quickly. So they manufactured something more efficient. They armed coastal kingdoms with guns and created a simple equation. Captives equaled guns. Guns equaled power. Power meant the ability to raid more villages for more captives. By 1690, about 30,000 Africans were being stolen yearly. By the 1780s, that number hit 85,000 per year. The ones who survived the march reached coastal forts with names that should be infamous. Cape Coast Castle, Elmina, Goree Island. Hundreds of people got packed into underground dungeons with no light, no ventilation, no sanitation. They sat in their own waste for weeks, sometimes months, waiting to be sold. Disease moved through these dungeons like wildfire. More bodies for mass graves, more people who died before touching water, so they never appear in your history books. And before we show you what happened to the survivors next, subscribe to Black Stories Untold. They spent centuries hiding the full death toll. Now we're bringing it to light. Now, back to the video. When the ships finally came, they weren't built for human transport. They were built for maximum profit with acceptable losses. Ship captains sat in offices, calculating death rates the way you'd calculate shipping damage on furniture. 20% mortality? Cost of doing business. Research published in 1794 documented the exact measurements. Men got 6 feet by 16 inches. Women got 5 feet by 16 inches. Children got 4.5 feet by 1 foot. Lie down right now and measure that space. You can't. The ceiling was too low to sit upright. You'd be there for 3 to 6 months, chained hand and foot to strangers on both sides. But before anyone boarded, there was a selection process that reveals the system's cruelty. Ship surgeons didn't heal people. They calculated commodity value. If you looked too weak, too sick, or too rebellious, you suffered what they literally called commercial death. You had no value. African traders would kill you right there on the beach rather than waste space on the ship. Luke Collingwood worked as one of these surgeons before he captained a ship called the Zong. Historians believe witnessing these selections repeatedly desensitized him to human suffering, preparing him psychologically for what he'd eventually order on that voyage. We'll get to that shortly. The conditions below deck defied comprehension. The heat was so extreme that candles couldn't burn from lack of oxygen, yet hundreds of people were confined there for months. The air became unbreathable. Crew members avoided going below because of the conditions. When someone died, and deaths were constant, the living often remained chained beside them for extended periods in darkness. Each person received 24 ounces of water daily. That's equivalent to 2 soda cans in suffocating heat. Food consisted of beans, corn, yams, and rice, once per day when available. Between 15 and 25% died on each voyage, succumbing to scurvy, smallpox, measles, and other diseases. Some stopped eating entirely, their will to survive breaking under conditions designed to strip away humanity. The crew threw bodies overboard so routinely that sharks learned to follow the ships. Certain trade routes became known as shark highways. Up to 2 million people died during the Middle Passage. On August 18, 1781, the slave ship Zong left Accra, Ghana, with 442 enslaved Africans, double its designed capacity. After taking on water at Sao Tome, it began the Atlantic crossing on September 6th. By November, navigational errors had extended the voyage. Water was running low. Captain Luke Collingwood, the same man who'd watched people killed on beaches for having no commodity value, made a calculation. Under maritime insurance law, if slaves died naturally at sea, owners got nothing. But if they were jettisoned to save the ship, that was covered under general average. The policy paid £30 per person. Over 3 days starting November 29th, the crew threw more than 130 people overboard, alive, conscious, screaming. They couldn't kill them first. That would complicate the insurance claim. They had to drown because lost at sea was claimable. Some jumped voluntarily when they realized what was happening, choosing their own death over waiting to be thrown. By the time the Zong docked in Jamaica on December 22nd, 142 black people had been killed. The ship still had 420 gallons of water in its hold. Plus, it had rained heavily during the killings, allowing them to collect 6 casks, enough for 11 days. When news reached England, the ship's owners filed their insurance claim. The insurers refused to pay. It went to court. Here's where the evil becomes clear. Nobody was charged with the killings. The trial wasn't about killing 142 human beings. The question before the court was whether the captain had legal authority to throw away his property and collect insurance. That was it, a property dispute. Granville Sharp, an abolitionist, tried desperately to have the crew prosecuted for the killings. He wrote to the Prime Minister. He wrote to naval officials. Nobody responded. At the appeal, Lord Chief Justice Mansfield ordered a retrial. Not because drowning people was wrong, but because new evidence about the rain proved the water shortage story was false. The insurance claim was fraudulent, but the underlying principle remained. Enslaved black people had the same legal status as cargo. Nobody was ever held accountable. Lloyd's of London started in a coffee house in 1688 and grew into one of the world's biggest insurance markets by calculating how many black people would die on each voyage. They processed death claims and profited every time another body hit the Atlantic. Some of these companies still exist today. Their wealth, their power, their marble buildings, all of it built on a foundation of black death. The system was perfectly designed. European ships carried manufactured goods, guns, textiles, wine, to Africa. Those goods bought human beings. Ships transported enslaved Africans to Caribbean and American plantations. The sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee produced by forced labor went back to Europe. 3 continents, 1 system. By the mid-1700s, enslaved Africans sold at American auctions for $800 to $1,200, equivalent to $32,000 to $48,000 today. Ship captains earned bonuses for hitting specific mortality rates. Banks financed the voyages. Governments protected the trade with naval power. Universities invested in trading companies. Every major institution participated and profited. Here's what destroys their narrative. Between 1650 and 1860, there were at least 485 documented violent rebellions during the slave trade. At least 392 of those were shipboard revolts. These people were chained, starving, sick, outnumbered, and trapped in the middle of the ocean. They still fought back, constantly. Ship captains lived in terror. That's why enslaved Africans stayed below deck in chains. That's why they were only allowed up for forced exercise. Captains made them dance to ensure they'd be healthy enough to sell. Not out of kindness, but fear of rebellion. In 1839, Joseph Cinque, a Mende man, was captured and loaded onto the Amistad with 52 others. Days into the voyage, Cinque picked the lock on his chains. He freed the others. They killed the captain and 2 crew members, seized control of the ship, and fought their way to freedom. The case reached the U.S. Supreme Court. Former President John Quincy Adams defended them. The court ordered them returned home to Africa. Heroes, warriors, freedom fighters. Historian David Richardson's research shows these resistors saved an estimated 600,000 Africans from being shipped during the 18th century, 1 million across the entire history of the trade. The constant threat of rebellion made the trade less profitable, reducing the total number captured. They erased these 392 documented shipboard revolts to maintain a lie. If students learned how fiercely Black people fought back, the docile slave myth collapses entirely. Children and teenagers were deliberately targeted. They were easier to control, had more years of forced labor ahead, and could be trained into submission. The demographic warfare was calculated. Enslaved people were overwhelmingly in their childbearing years, teens and young adults. African societies were left with the elderly and disabled, the people least capable of rebuilding. By 1820, 4 Africans had crossed the Atlantic for every 1 European. 4 out of 5 women who crossed the Atlantic were African. Think about that demographic collapse. The generations never born. The knowledge never passed down. The societies that never developed because their human capital was systematically extracted for 4 centuries. European traders armed coastal kingdoms, creating a cycle where captives brought guns, and guns brought more captives. Economies that had thrived on gold trade and farming got warped into human trafficking operations. When European colonialism arrived in the 1800s, they pointed to Africa's backwardness as justification, ignoring that they'd created that devastation through centuries of extraction. In 2001, at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, African nations demanded formal recognition and apologies. The United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States blocked it because apologies mean acknowledgement. Acknowledgement means responsibility. Responsibility means reparations. So they softened the history instead. Death tolls got minimized to 12 million when the real number reaches 15 to 20 million. The 392 shipboard revolts got erased. They called it the slave trade instead of systematic mass extermination for profit. Modern banks, insurance companies, and universities trace their wealth directly to slavery, but they don't want you doing that math. Between 1500 and 1880, approximately 12.4 million Africans were loaded onto ships. Canadian scholar Adam Jones called it what it was, one of the worst atrocities in human history. They want you to think of enslaved Africans as passive victims. The truth? They were farmers, merchants, warriors, artists, musicians, blacksmiths, goldsmiths, with full identities and heritage before Europeans stripped it away. And they fought through 392 documented shipboard revolts and millions of acts of resistance to reclaim it. Now you know the real numbers. You know about the first passage they never taught. You know about insurance companies profiting from drowning Black people. You know about the 392 rebellions they erased. You can't unknow it. And when we understand the full truth, we can demand full justice. Subscribe to Black Stories Untold if this changed how you see history. Hit that like button so the algorithm stops suppressing this. Share it, because they're still teaching the sanitized version in schools right now. Drop a comment with the one fact that hit you hardest. We've got more hidden history to expose, and we're not stopping until everyone knows what they tried to bury.